Hello again. Welcome to another video from Huddle Psychology. Welcome to the Huddle Psychology YouTube channel. I hope the previous two videos were helpful to you. We dealt with gaslighting, and after that we dealt with love bombing. As I mentioned, we are continuing with the psychological manipulation theme. And so today we are going to look at another manipulative technique that is used against us to make us suffer. Manipulators use this very often with us, and it happens in all types of relationships, and you must be very familiar with it. Some of us may not be very familiar with it, but you must have certainly heard this term before. Today we are talking about guilt tripping. So you must have heard this term before. Guilt tripping is another form of psychological manipulation where the manipulator essentially tries to make you feel guilty. The manipulator is going to use your own emotions against you. Emotions such as guilt, creating an unhealthy sense of obligation. All of these are weapons in the hands of the guilt tripper. So what does guilt tripping mean? Guilt tripping is essentially a form of manipulation where the manipulator makes you feel guilty about what he or she is doing in order to achieve what the tripper wants for himself or herself through you. That is essentially what guilt tripping is all about. So to make you really understand what this is, let's look at some examples. So beginning with relationships. So in a relationship between two partners, a spouse can very well say to the partner, to the other spouse, something like this. I wish you could spend, if you really truly believed in me or loved me, if you really felt something for me, you would spend more time with me instead of spending time with your friends. That is a statement that is used a lot of times in relationships to make the other person feel guilty for the time he or she may be spending with other people. So if you really feel for me, if you really love me, spend less time with other people. Wouldn't you spend time with me rather than other people? Making you feel a sense of obligation and guilt. Another example may be the parent-child dynamics, where the parent might say something like, after all that I have done for you, after all that I have done for you, is this the way you repay me? You often hear this, especially in a country like India, when it comes to situations, major milestones, such as choosing of a career, or when it comes to a milestone such as marriage decisions, parents usually use this tactic against their own children by saying things like, for all the things that I have done for you, for all the sacrifices I've made for you, is this the way you repay? Right? That's another example of guilt tripping. Another scenario of guilt tripping within a parent and child dynamic. It can happen within friendships. A friend can come up to you and say that, looks like I'm the only one who's making any efforts in this friendship. Looks like I'm the only one who really cares for this friendship, considering the little effort that you are putting in. That's another example of making you feel guilty within a friendship relationship. And finally, within a workplace setting, within the office setting, your manager can come up to you and say, hey, look, I need you to pick up this project. I need you to do this. And if you don't do this, you're letting the entire team down, making you feel obligated to do it. Maybe something that you do not want to do it. Maybe something that you don't have the time to do it. But nevertheless, making you feel guilty for not doing it. So these are all kind of examples where the manipulator is using guilt as a way to achieve something that they want to achieve through you by making you feel guilty and obligated to them. So, these are some examples of guilt tripping. Now, let us look at how guilt trippers actually operate. Let's look at how it actually works. First and foremost, you will understand that there is a great amount of emotional manipulation that takes place. The guilt tripper uses emotional manipulation to make you feel guilty or obligated by saying things like I've said before, after all the things that I've done for you, or with phrases like, okay, fine, I'll suffer alone then. These are some very common statements of guilt tripping you, the tripper using these sentences to make you feel guilty. So, emotional manipulation is one way of making it work for the guilt tripper. Secondly, the guilt tripper tends to play the victim. They always position themselves as the person who is suffering because of you. So they make it feel as if that if you don't do something for them, they are the victim. They are the one who's suffering. So they play the victim card in order for you to feel, oh my God, if I don't do this, my parents will suffer, or my parents will feel bad, or my boss will feel bad, my friend will feel bad. So effectively, they play the victim card so that you feel an unhealthy amount of obligation towards them to do what the guilt tripper wants you to do. Then there is obviously the passive aggressive techniques that guilt trippers tend to use a lot. By this, I mean sarcastic comments. So, for example, someone might come up to you and say, huh, it might feel very nice to have all this free time to yourself, huh? You know, you might be sitting there reading a book or listening to music, and this person just comes along and passes a sarcastic comment, which is a very passive aggressive way of dealing with you by saying that it might feel so good, huh, to have all this free time. So essentially, what the person is saying is that you are not spending time with that person, right? By passing that comment, you will then feel a sense of emotional obligation. You feel guilty for spending time reading. You feel guilty for having some me time. That is essentially what the guilt tripper is trying to do anyway. So, passive aggressive techniques is another way guilt tripping actually works. And finally, I cannot emphasize this enough, but there is always an overemphasis on sacrifice. So, like I said before, the guilt tripper will always talk about the past, always talk about how much they have sacrificed in order to bring you up or give you this or give you that. You know, all the sacrifices that that person has made is put in front of you, is put on the table for you to look at, so that you build up a certain amount of obligation in your mind, a certain amount of obligation in your heart, and making you feel guilty that if you don't act accordingly, then you are in some ways you are breaking trust, or you're breaking a sacred bond with that person. So there's always a great amount of emphasis, a great overemphasis on all the sacrifices that the person has made. They will always keep talking about the sacrifices to you so that you feel guilty about it and you feel obligated to return the favor in some way or form. So that is another technique that the guilt tripper uses with aplomb to achieve what he or she wants to achieve from you. So these are some ways that guilt tripping actually works. Fair enough. Now, let's look at some telltale signs. How do you actually identify? How do you know that you're being guilt tripped? So it's important to know some symptoms, some signs, so that you can break away from the cycle of manipulation. The first one is an erosion of self-worth. By this, what I mean is that this constant reminding that I have done this for you, I have done that for you, making you feel guilty, constantly making you feel guilty, makes you, in the long run, short to medium term, or even in the long run, starts making you feel inadequate. No matter what you have done, it's never enough. It's never enough for the guilt tripper. So the guilt tripper will always keep making you feel guilty and keep on making you have a sense of obligation to keep giving more and more and more of what you have to the guilt tripper, to the extent that you will start feeling that there is never an end to this. It's never adequate. So you start feeling a sense of inadequacy and you start questioning, and there is a slow erosion of your self-worth itself. So that is one telltale sign that you are being manipulated through guilt. That's point number one. Point number two is fatigue. Just trying to meet the expectations of the guilt tripper, because he or she is always going to say, do this for me or do that for me. I've done this for you. I've sacrificed this for you. So essentially, they are giving you their expectations. And for you to keep on meeting their expectations, their never-ending expectations, can lead to emotional fatigue. You just feel tired at the end of the day, right? So being manipulated like this, taking you for a guilt trip and making you feel obligated all the time, where the obligations are never ending, you will end up emotionally fatigued. So that's another sign to watch out for, to look out for. Then obviously, when someone's guilt tripping you all the time, making you feel inadequate all the time, eventually there is a built up of resentment with that person. So in the long run, there will be frictions in the relationships, and there will be breakage of that bond, that trust, or if there was any love ever in between those two people, it will suffer. So the relationship will suffer, and there will be a greater amount of resentment between you and that person. So that's another you need to watch out for. If there is any building up of resentment between you and another individual who has been using guilt and obligation to get things done, and if you start feeling resentment towards the person, something to watch out for, to know that maybe you are being taken for a guilt trip. And finally, there is difficulty setting boundaries, because as you get more and more dragged into guilt tripping and into the control of the guilt tripper, it becomes very difficult to kind of set boundaries, healthy boundaries, and you will end up prioritizing the whims and fancies of the guilt tripper more than yours. And that's always unhealthy, because you have the right to put your issues, your dreams, your priorities ahead of other people's. And if over a period of time, if there is consistent guilt tripping happening to you, you slowly start losing the power of prioritizing yourself above others, and you start putting the guilt tripper above yourself, which leads to an unhealthy situation where you don't focus on your own growth, on your own health, on your own well-being. So that can happen too. So that's another a telltale sign that you're being taken for a ride. There is guilt tripping happening. And if that is happening, if any of these things are happening to you, it's probably worthwhile to take a step back and assess your relationship with the individual or individuals, as the case may be, and to look at the relationships with a more critical eye, so to speak, right? So these were some signs and symptoms. Now, to the next segment as to why people use guilt trip as a mechanism. Once again, this is not very different from the previous videos and the previous tactics, because manipulation is manipulation, right? Point number one is obviously always going to be control and power. So guilt trippers use guilt tripping to create a sense of obligation towards them, and by that they gain a certain amount of control and power over you. That's point number one. Then secondly, they want to avoid direct communication and rejection. Remember, it is always they are trying to communicate something to you. They want something from you, but they will never say that directly, because they fear that you may reject it point blank, and they don't want that. So for example, let's talk about a marriage situation, and a parent is telling the child his or her opinion about marriage. Instead of having a mature and open conversation where the parent is exchanging or sharing an opinion with their child, instead of having a direct conversation, the parent essentially ends up guilt tripping the child by saying things like, after all I've done for you, after all the sacrifices I've made for you, is this the way you treat me? Is this the way you treat us? Blah, blah, blah. So instead of having that direct conversation, that mature conversation, they essentially guilt trip you to avoid that direct conversation because they fear that you might just reject their point of stance or their argument or their point of view. So another reason for guilt tripping is to circumvent direct communication and use guilt tripping and obligation to get you to agree to their point of view. So that's something to really keep in mind in terms of why people actually do guilt tripping, use guilt tripping as a technique. Secondly, of course, guilt tripping is also about insecurity. People use guilt tripping to make you obligated to them. They are insecure about losing you, and by making you obligated to them and making you feel guilty, they have control over you. And essentially, they make themselves central to your life. They want to be in the middle of your life, right bang in the center, and they don't want to be anywhere else in the corner. So it's their own insecurity that they cannot deal with, and that they project and they make use of, and to reduce that their own suffering, they use guilt trip to become center attraction or the centerpiece of your life. So insecurity is a major driver of guilt tripping as a manipulation technique. And finally, it is also a cultural thing. Sometimes people learn guilt tripping. It's a learned behavior. In some societies and some cultures, people just use guilt tripping very casually to get to agreements, to solve problems, to reach some sort of consensus. Where there is a disagreement between individuals, they very casually use guilt tripping as a method to put people in place, so to speak. So you would have, some people would have grown up in that kind of system, in that kind of a culture, and they kind of pick that up as a learned behavior, and that becomes then later on in life a driving factor to use in their other relationships. So learned behavior of guilt tripping can be another main driver and motivation behind using guilt tripping as a motive, as a tactic for manipulating you. So these are reasons why people actually do it. Fair enough. Now, what can you do to protect yourself, right? First and foremost, the most important thing is recognizing it. You cannot break away from guilt tripping without knowing that you are being guilt tripped. So, pay attention to your feelings. Pay attention to how you feel within the conversations. Are you feeling a sense of obligation building up, unhealthy amount of obligation building up? Are you feeling that the person is driving a huge amount of guilt, making you feel guilty within yourself? If you are, then pay attention to those feelings. Don't dismiss them. So recognizing it is the first step to protecting yourself, right? So protect yourself by recognizing it. Secondly, acknowledge other people's feelings. It's important to acknowledge other people's feelings. Fine, they might be telling you what they are feeling. Acknowledge them. But you can acknowledge them and don't take responsibility for them. That's a very healthy way of dealing with it. So you might be facing a guilt tripper and the person is making their feelings very vocal to you, saying things like, after all I have done for you, I think I'll suffer alone, etc., etc. You can acknowledge their feelings. You can acknowledge their feelings by saying things such as, I understand where you're coming from. I see your viewpoint. But I'm sorry, I cannot change my decision. Right? So you can acknowledge their viewpoint, you can acknowledge their feelings, but you don't necessarily need to take responsibility for it. So that's a very important thing to remember. Thirdly, set very clear boundaries. Be absolutely clear as to what is acceptable to you and what is not acceptable to you. When the feelings are running high and when people are trying to guilt trip you and when you're feeling guilty all the time, you're feeling inadequate all the time, it's important that you set very clear boundaries and say that you will not tolerate being treated like this. So set very clear boundaries so that you do not get carried away with the guilt tripper. So that's another way of protecting yourself. Always try and redirect the conversation. Remember, the guilt tripper tends to go back in history all the time, goes back into the past. I've done that. We've done this for you. It's all in the past. So at that time, you can respond by saying that this seems to be an important topic to you. Can we sit down and talk about it face to face without bringing in the past? Let's keep past in the past. Let's have a present moment conversation, right? So always try to converge, bring the conversation back to the present moment. The guilt tripper always likes to go back in the past and make you feel guilty for things that they have done in the past and make you do things that you don't want to do in the present, make you do things they want you to do in the present. So that is the dynamics of guilt tripping. So when such conversations are happening, try and bring the conversation back to the present moment instead of languishing in the past, wallowing in the past, and then falling into the trap of the guilt tripper and becoming emotionally confused because of it. So that's another thing. And finally, when the guilt tripper is trying to make a point, you can, as I said before, you can acknowledge their feelings, but you needn't take responsibility. And an additional point to this is that you can give your explanation. So, for example, when you say that, sorry, I understand your feelings, but I cannot change my decision. And for that, you can give an adequate amount of explanation delivered calmly, without anger, without explosion, without explicitives, without any threats, without any fighting, without any arguments. You can convey your reasoning behind your words in a calm and sensible manner. You don't need to go around over explaining and then try and fall into the guilt tripper's trap. The guilt tripper will obviously try to keep coming back to the emphasis, the overemphasis on all the extra sacrifices that they have made in the past, etc. You don't need to over explain. You can stick to your basic explanation and get on with it. So do not over explain yourself, because the more you get into over explanation, the more chance you are giving the guilt tripper to come back with more examples of all the sacrifices that they have made for you. So these are some ways to protect yourself from it. Now, supporting others in terms of guilt tripping, if you know people who are already suffering from guilt tripping, your friends, your family members, as always, validate their experiences, because the guilt tripper will not. You need to be there, you need to be present, you need to validate their feelings, you need to validate their experiences. Encourage healthy communication so that the person and your friend and the guilt tripper can have healthy communication between each other. So always encourage healthy communication, offer emotional support, and always suggest for professional help if things are not working out with the usual steps taken, as we just discussed. If things are getting out of control, always encourage your friend or your family member to seek external help so that they can process their emotions better. They can help themselves resolve their complications and unshackle them from the cycle of manipulation through guilt tripping. So that is all about guilt tripping. We talked about what guilt tripping is, fairly simple to understand. It is about making you feel guilty and emotional, and making you feel an unhealthy amount of obligation towards the guilt tripper. And they use this by playing on your own emotions, such as guilt and obligations, etc. That's what guilt tripping is all about. And you know it happening to you when you are feeling emotionally fatigued, and you are feeling a certain amount of erosion of self-worth. You feel resentment, and you are finding it difficult to maintain boundaries. These are telltale signs of being guilt tripped. So that is all about guilt tripping. If you want to know more about it, please go to our blog site, where we have long form article about guilt tripping with suggested reading and references. If you want to dig deeper into the subject, please be our guests. Do leave us comments for as constructive feedback so that we can improve our content. And I hope that this particular video has given you some amount of insight into guilt tripping as a technique, as a way of psychological manipulation. Hope it has given you some insight, and hope it helps you to recognize the next time you are being guilt tripped, and hope it gives you some high level insights into what you can do. And I hope our article in our blog, huddlepsychology.substack.com, will give you much more insight, more information in terms of how you can deal with this problem yourself. And I hope this has a meaningful impact in your life. If you liked this video, please like it and share it as far and wide as possible so that we can spread awareness about guilt tripping as a manipulative technique to as many people as possible, because we want people to be free from the cycle of manipulation. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel so that you can get more fresh and interesting and innovative content from us. And that's all from me in this video about guilt tripping. We'll come back next time with another topic, with another technique of manipulation. So until next time, please keep flourishing and be well.